but I was asked to talk today a little bit about exercise and nutrition and some of the work that we've done and some of the work that we are doing in childhood myositis here in Toronto, and some of the work that's been done elsewhere around the world. Now, I showed this slide at the Cure JM Medical Conference in Chicago last year. And this goes back to my father's advice to me when I was quite young. And what he said is that if you want to be healthy all your life, you need to do 4 things. He said you need to sleep well, you need to eat well, you need to get proper exercise, and you need to get lots of fresh air. And although it's a bit of a research hobby for me, a bit of a sideline, I've been trying to study some of these things as they apply to chronic diseases in children, and in particular chronic rheumatic diseases, including dermatomyositis, to see if in fact my dad was right. So let's talk first about exercise. There's a strong rationale for why exercise in kids with dermatomyositis might be beneficial and important. We know that dermatomyositis, because of the muscle inflammation and pain that occurs, leads to muscle dysfunction. The muscles don't work as well and there's weakness. And when there's weakness, there's limitation in activities and the kinds of activities that we would normally expect for kids of similar ages. That activity limitation leads to deconditioning. The kids are less fit, and decondition leads to restriction in participation in the kinds of things that we would like kids to be doing during their developmental ages. Things like gym class, sports, dance, hobbies, and stuff like that. Not only that, but activity limitation may in fact lead to more muscle inflammation and more pain on the basis of dysregulation of the immune system, information that I'm not going to really share today just because of time. So if we break this cycle, it's possible that just through exercise, we can see some improvements in addition to the medications we use to reduce inflammation in our children with dermatomyositis. And there's been a lot of research in this area. So we know for a fact that children with myositis are deconditioned. Studies that go back a number of years, even a few decades now, both in Europe, in Holland, in the United States, and in Brazil, have shown us that when compared to other matched children of the same age, children with dermatomyositis, even when they don't have active disease, are less fit. And these fitness deficiencies persist often long after the disorder has gone into remission. And we know this from follow-up studies that have been done in the Scandinavian countries, as well as in Holland. So even as adults, when the disease is long gone into remission, patients with dermatomyositis are less fit than their peers. Now, how do we study these kinds of things? We study them with exercise testing. And I just want to show you, we haven't yet published this. This paper is being reviewed right now. Just one of the ways that we look at exercise testing in our clinic at Sick Kids. The Wingate test was developed at the Wingate Institute in Israel. And what it is, it's all out maximal cycling task on a stationary bicycle done for 30 seconds. So the kids get on and they bicycle as hard as they can for 30 seconds. And we look at a variety of different things, one of which is peak power. Now, many of you will be familiar with the childhood myositis assessment score, which I have on the horizontal axis of this graph, the CMAS. And that takes about 15 or 20 minutes with a skilled therapist or physician to do. It's a lot of activities that the children have to do, a lot of holding their hands up high in the air for a long time or holding their heads off the bed. I think many of you probably would have experienced this in your clinics. And what we found is that, number one, we could substitute not just the CMAS, but a number of the other tasks that we do in clinic to try and see how our kids are doing in terms of their muscle strength and activity, just with the 10-second first portion, that's the peak power, I'm showing the vertical axis here, of that Wingate test. But what's even more important than that is if you look at the CMAS score, which goes from 0, which is no real activity possible at all, up to a maximum of 52, you can see that a lot of our patients reach 52, yet they're spread out in terms of how much power they're able to do on the Wingate test, meaning that they're being called normal by the CMAS, whereas there's still significant weakness compared to other kids, even with dermatomyositis their age. So some of these exercise tests are really quite important. And when we ask kids in the clinic whether it was easy, fun, whether they would do it again, and it should be a regular part of the clinic, the majority of them said yes, they agreed or strongly agreed that this was a good way to assess how well they're doing in terms of their muscle strength and endurance. I'm bringing this particular test up now, not because it was so important in those previous studies, but because it's very important in some of the work we're doing now that I'm going to show you later. Now, we've done a ton of, well, I shouldn't say a ton, we've done a number of exercise intervention trials in other pediatric rheumatic conditions, but we in Toronto haven't done that in kids with dermatomyositis, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later too. We've done randomized trials of getting kids into exercise programs to see how well their juvenile arthritis improves, or their fibromyalgia, and so on. This is just one very recent study. Again, I'm bringing it up to set the stage for later, where we weren't actually hoping, this is a very small study, these are kids with arthritis, not dermatomyositis. We weren't hoping to see whether they actually were more active, but we just wondered whether giving them something like a Fitbit would encourage the kids to be more active. And this was a feasibility study just to see if we could get the kids to wear it. And it turned out it was very feasible. It didn't really make much of an improvement in terms of the number and amount, the number of minutes and the amount of time the kids were spent exercising. We didn't expect it would, but part of that was because we used really cheap versions of the Fitbit. They weren't Fitbit, it was a different brand, and half of them broke while the kids were using it, and batteries failed on the other half. So I'm bringing this up because we're going to use this approach now to study kids with dermatomyositis that I'll tell you about in a little while. Although we haven't studied, it has been studied. Exercise training for kids with dermatomyositis has been studied most prominently by Esther Habers as her PhD project, working in Utrecht in Holland, in the Netherlands, in the Muscles in Motion study. This was a randomized controlled trial. So some kids were exercised and other kids acted as a control group, where they did strength training and interval aerobic training and found that it was safe with kids with dermatomyositis, feasible, the kids could do it, and in some areas, they actually improved. So they improved, for example, in things like their child health assessment questionnaire, which some of you may be familiar with, is widely used in dermatomyositis as a measure of restriction of ability to do activities. But they improved on that and improved on things like their jumping and their sit-ups and their push-ups. So exercise may be of benefit. And we also know from a before-after study that in those young adults, long after they've had their dermatomyositis gone into remission, that exercise training was able to reverse some of the deficits that people saw in the long term. And you can see that by before and after training bar chart that I'm pointing out with my cursor here, when we looked at their maximal aerobic capacity, which is on the vertical axis. So exercise is probably a benefit. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing in dermatomyositis. Let's talk just very quickly about sleep, because the other thing my dad said was super important was getting good and proper sleep. Now, we did a study and published this some time ago where we looked in kids who had arthritis and kids with dermatomyositis to compare their sleep based on a questionnaire, sleep quality, and other measures of life. And we found that sleep was strongly related. Worse sleep led to more fatigue, worse sleep led to more pain, and worse sleep led to a worse overall quality of life and a really strong relationship. And not only that, 40% of the children with dermatomyositis had moderate to severely impaired sleep. So we know that sleep is a big deal for families and patients with dermatomyositis. We haven't done this with dermatomyositis. We're doing it now with arthritis. We're doing a study bribing children to sleep longer and comparing it to their regular shorter sleep to see if it will reduce their pain. We're almost finished that study. A little bit of delay because of COVID, but we're almost back on track. And those results will be available hopefully within a few months. It is something I'd like to do with dermatomyositis patients as well. But at any point in time, I only have about 60 children with dermatomyositis that I follow at Sick Kids. And that's not enough to really do a study like this. So we would have to do it with our partners in other centers to see if we can make kids feel better with their despite having dermatomyositis by just getting them to sleep more. I suspect the answer would be positive, it would be yes, but we haven't studied it yet in those kids. Now, what about diet? My dad talked to us as kids a lot about eating the proper foods, and that would keep us healthy. We hear a ton about diet now, especially since COVID hit on the internet. Everybody's very interested in this, but it's probably super complicated. A little bit more complicated to study and to know about than exercise or sleep. This is a fellow named Eran Segal. He's an Israeli scientist. He's done a 10,000 person study around the world looking at a very simple thing, whether you can predict whether someone's blood sugar would go up compared to the different foods that they eat. But they did it in a very smart, sophisticated way. If you want to hear his TED Talk, that's the YouTube address right there. Very, very interesting work, and they published a book about this as well. In my mind, the reason why this is so complex is that it's not as simple as diet affecting the inflammation in children with myositis, but rather there's an intermediary, something called the microbiome. Now, the microbiome are all the germs that live inside our body, on our skin, in our lungs, in our mouth, and largely in our intestines, in our gut. The microbiome is full of both healthy and unhealthy germs, and what we eat is really food for them. And they then become a giant chemical factory sitting in our intestines, producing chemicals, some of which reduce inflammation and some of which increase inflammation. The type and the number of germs in everybody's intestine is as unique as a fingerprint. Two brothers or brother and a sister, two sisters will have a different microbiome, even living in the same house and eating the same food. And because it's unique, I think that might explain why diet has not universally been found to be helpful, or the same diet has not been universally helpful for kids with different inflammation conditions, including dermatomyositis. It probably depends a lot on your unique microbiome. Now, in Dr. Segal's study, what they did was they tried to predict what happened to your blood sugar based on what you ate. And this was with 10,000 people, measuring their blood sugars and their diet over a period of time. And what they found is they could predict about 15% of the variability in blood glucose based on the foods that you ate. Only 15%. 85% of the variability could not be explained. So it didn't matter, carbs, proteins, whatever, couldn't explain it. However, they went and measured people's poo, their stool, and looked at the germs in the poo. And they found if you could determine the germs in the stool, in the poo, and you knew what they ate, you could now predict 50% of the variability in the rise in blood sugar. And they postulate, and they have some evidence to show this, that just with a handful of genes, if you know just a few genes, and the microbiome, and the diet, you can almost completely predict what someone's response to different foods would be in terms of their blood sugar. Blood sugar is just one tiny part of how the body reacts to our diet. As I said, the microbiome is full of all these germs that are this giant chemical factory that produce chemicals that can either increase inflammation or decrease inflammation. And it's likely that when we have a better understanding of the microbiome and people's genes, then we could determine diets that would help reduce the inflammation in dermatomyositis. And we're just starting to look at how to do studies like this in kids with inflammatory conditions now, and we're about to write a grant to do this, but we haven't done it yet. This is the book, by the way, by Dr. Segal and his partner, Dr. Elanav, in case you're interested in the work that they've done and how it might apply to us when it comes to things like losing weight and preventing disease. We've taken a much simpler approach in our studies, and that's really looking at supplementation and whether supplements can help improve the lives of children with dermatomyositis. Now, we know that the weakness in the muscles seems to have something to do with chemical energy insufficiency in the muscles due to the inflammation in dermatomyositis. This study, which goes back 20 years, looked at a fancy magnetic resonance image, not the pictures of the muscles, but rather the spectroscopy, the chemical structure of the muscles in kids with juvenile dermatomyositis. This was based on earlier studies looking at adult patients with myositis and showing that the energy was insufficient, the energy production was insufficient in muscles of children with dermatomyositis. This is the way the energy cycle works. ATP, which I'm showing you here, is adenosine triphosphate. That's adenosine. It's got 3 little phosphates on it. Those phosphates are attached to the adenosine molecule with a chemical bond. When that chemical bond is broken and a phosphate is taken off, it provides energy for muscle contraction. So ATP is like the muscle currency, if you like. It's like the muscle money we have in the energy money we have in the bank. Once that phosphate comes off, we have the adenosine and 2 phosphates, that's ADP, adenosine diphosphate. In order to return that to its energy state, we have to attach another phosphate to the ADP, and phosphate is carried from our diet to our ADP by a molecule called creatine. Creatine forms creatine phosphate and deposits the phosphate on ADP to make ATP, which is what we really want. And we know that in other muscle conditions, like for example, the muscular dystrophies, that if we give kids with muscular dystrophies creatine, this was a meta-analysis of 4 randomized trials, that muscle dystrophies improve and the patients get stronger and more functional. So the muscle capacity is better given creatine supplementation. And of course, bodybuilders and athletes all over the world take creatine to provide more energy to their muscles so they can perform better in their sport or build bigger muscles. We also know that in adults who have dermatomyositis or polymyositis, that supplementation with creatine at least causes a moderate effect in improving strength and function. Now, this was a randomized study that was done by a number of European colleagues. In addition to providing creatine, these patients also took on an exercise program. But our colleagues in Sao Paulo in Brazil did a study that showed that in their patients with children with dermatomyositis, the creatine didn't really help very much. So we were interested in this, and we decided to study this in Toronto in our patients. And this paper has just been published a couple of weeks ago. So this is the effect of creatine supplementation on muscle function in childhood myositis. Now, what we did is we took 13 children in our clinic. They were between the ages of 7 and 18, so we could do all the fancy exercise studies that needed to be done. They all had dermatomyositis and were on a stable course of medications. So they were all stable. These were not brand new patients that we were studying. And we used something called a multiple baseline design. And the way this works, these are the 13 patients here. They went on, randomly chosen by a random computer program, a period of identical placebo, and then without them knowing, or without us knowing, were switched to creatine supplementation. And we monitored them every month for 6 months with a variety of different tests to see if when they switched to creatine, they got better. Now, the tests that we did were exercise tests like that Wingate test. that I was telling you about before, that 30-second all-out cycling test. We looked at how well they jumped, what their hand grip was like. We looked at all the kinds of measures we do in our clinic in terms of checking for muscle strength, the C-mass, and so on. We looked at questionnaires that looked at quality of life and fatigue, how adherent they were with treatment, how satisfied they were with it, and how active they were. But what we also did is we put them in the MRI scanner, and with a non-magnetic, it's not really a stationary cycle, it's more like a stepper. And we had them do exercise in the magnetic resonance imaging machine and looked with spectroscopic analysis, that is chemical analysis, at what was happening to that ADP and that ATP and the creatine in their muscles. Now, in this study of our 13 patients, we found that the creatine was well tolerated. There were no side effects. The kids did fine with it. And the creatine in this particular study was from a German company, and they made it up for us in kind of pills rather than powder form, and it tasted like lemon drops. The kids actually liked it. It was fine. But we didn't see any change in the clinical measures. So this, on the vertical axis here, I'm showing you that peak power from the Wingate test, but this could have been any of those other things. The creatine patients really didn't do much better than placebo patients, which you see here on average is the dark line in the middle of these boxes. However, when we exercised them in the MRI, we did show that there was much more energy substrate and faster recovery and better aerobic processes in the creatine, with the creatine supplementation than there was without. So let me just, this is a very complicated table, but basically what we saw was this. If you look here, so this is the amount of phosphate that's floating around. This is the amount of phosphocreatine, that is creatine with a phosphate on it. And this is the amount of ATP after exercise. And once this comes up to around here where the dotted line is, that's when the patients have recovered after their exercise. This is before creatine, and this is after creatine, and you can see recovery occurred quite a bit sooner. We found more ATP was produced during recovery. We found more phosphocreatine relative to just phosphate floating around after exercise, so this was working. We found less metabolic stress on the muscles after exercise, and an overall increase in total ATP production. So over the course of our study, the creatine by itself was not enough to make the kids feel better or do better. But there was evidence from our MRI that this should be pursued. So this is what we're doing now. Actually, what we're doing now is nothing because of COVID. Our study has been completely closed down, but in fact, I just got an email today, this afternoon, that we're now approved to start enrolling in a CureJM funded study where we're now combining creatine supplementation with exercise, like they did in the adult study, and adding in coenzyme Q10, an additional supplement that might improve the way the muscle energy is developed and used in parts of our cells called mitochondria. And we're going to use a very similar design. And we're excited to get started because this was put on hold for a very long time. But we're excited to get started. We'll likely start enrolling patients in the next few weeks into this study. And so if you ask me a year from now, hopefully we can tell you whether combining exercise, and the exercise program has a lot to do with the Fitbit that we talked about before. So we're going to use the Fitbit as a motivating factor for our kids, because it did work to do that in our previous study. Whether the combination of all these things is going to make a difference. And hopefully we'll get a start in the next year or two, once we figure out how to do it, on an actual diet intervention study to see if just changing the diet can improve kids with myositis. Now, the one thing I haven't studied is how fresh air factors into all these things, but these are the things that my dad had told me about. Good sleep seems to be very important. It's definitely disordered in kids with dermatomyositis. A proper diet. Well, supplementation, we're studying it now. Hopefully it's going to help the kids to feel better. But I'm sure in general, once we've sorted out the complex interchange between diet and the microbiome, We'll figure out ways to provide an anti-inflammatory diet, individualized for each patient. Exercise clearly seems to be beneficial, and we recommend it for all of our patients with dermatomyositis. And eventually we'll get around to studying fresh air too, because I bet you that's important too. I think my dad was probably right on all 4 counts. Anyways, that's all I have to talk about. I want to turn it over to Julie, and then I'm happy to take any questions.
And Julie, you may know, but you are on mute currently.
There we go. Let me unmute myself before I share my screen. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Feldman. Great information. Looking forward to asking some questions after this. I am going to go ahead and let's start talking about nutrition. So first and foremost, I am a JM mom. My daughter Tessa was diagnosed at the age of 4. I always like to point that out because I have been through the very intense treatment. And in terms of nutrition, I have been through, our family has been through the intense weight gain and all the side effects of the medication. I always like to point this out because when you're in that phase, it's very easy to focus on your child in that moment and the weight gain and worrying about the future and are they ever going to recover from this? Are they ever going to maintain a healthy weight and healthy eating again? So I like to encourage parents. This is my daughter at 4, and then fast forward to 15, she did maintain a great relationship with food and maintain a healthy weight, and food is a very important and fun part of her life. So what can we cover? I'm going to go real quick. We have about 20 minutes. We're going to touch on the basic nutrition and health guidelines. We're going to talk about special considerations for juvenile myositis, some popular diets you may have heard of or may be considering. And then most important, we're going to finish up with talking about the feeding environment. So when I talk about that, that is not the actual food that's put on the plate, but it is the environment that you create in your home, your attitudes toward food and mealtime, which are critical when you're raising children. So first, we have dietary guidelines for Americans that are ending in 2020. We should get new ones out this year. As Dr. Feldman really well stated, that nutrition is very individual. And so what I want to point out is when you see these dietary guidelines, these are made for policy making. They're not an individual diet prescription. So we're going to go over these just so you know where the public policy is coming from. But they're very general messages and they're not an individual diet. So high calorie snacks, generally we want to try to replace with nutrient dense snacks. When we say nutrient dense, we're talking about things where we can identify vitamins, minerals, fiber, protein, healthy fats. Food products and with added sugars, changing that to fruit. So when we're talking about a children's diet, we often see fruit snacks, fruit bars, fruit roll-ups. We really want to try to replace those products with just the actual whole fruit. Refined grains, we're talking about white bread, white pasta, white rice. We want to try to shift, generally speaking, to more whole grain products. Snacks with added sugars, we want to shift towards less sugar and unsalted snacks. And for our fats, generally speaking, we want to try to have fats that are liquid at room temperature versus solid at room temperature. And then in terms of beverages, beverages with added sugars is a major, major problem with our young people these days. We are raising the Starbucks generation. So we have a huge amount of sugar and non-nutrient dense calories with our children. So ideally we want to educate our children about that and shift more towards no sugar added beverages. And when we're talking about children, that generally means water and an unflavored milk or milk substitute. This My Plate is a guideline that is used. And the one thing that I like to use with families, everyone asks me, well, what do I give my children? How do I present the meal? What I like to do is tell them to divide their plate in half, as you see in this visual, and look at the left half of the plate. The left half is completely made up of fruits and vegetables. There are some controversy on the right, whether the types of proteins or the types of grains or the dairy or no dairy. There's controversy on the right side of the plate, but on the left side, we don't find much controversy or many people saying that fruits and vegetables are not good for us. So again, divide your plate in half and try to fill half of the plate with fruits and vegetables. Let's talk about JM nutrient needs. Due to the treatment that our kids are on, calcium is something that you want to have a conversation with your doctor about. The calcium needs, generally speaking, for children are 8 to 1200 milligrams, adolescents 12 to 1500 milligrams per day. If you analyze a child's diet, most of the kids that I work with are getting some of their calcium needs met, not necessarily all of them. So generally speaking, most of my kids are supplementing between 400 to 800 milligrams of calcium. Depending on their food intake. Vitamin D is 400 to 800 IUs per day recommended. Most of the children's multivitamins and vitamin D supplements will contain about 400. So if your child's already on a multivitamin, they may be getting their vitamin D needs met already. Many of the children that we work with, they are recommended to be on a children's multivitamin. And I want to stress this is a multivitamin with minerals. So this is not a gummy vite. This is more of a chewable, one you have to bite with your back teeth, that has minerals in it, not just vitamins. I put a question mark of iron there. You'll want to talk to your doctor, and your iron status of your child is probably pretty well known if they have their basic blood work done. So you can ask your doctor if iron supplementation is needed. Some children's multivitamins will have a little bit in them already. So the question is, do you need more or not? Iron is not something you want to supplement with if it is not needed. So have it checked first. You also can have vitamin D levels checked, which can be useful to determining whether supplementation or how much is needed. And then a lot of people talk to me about probiotics, and this goes back to what Dr. Feldman talked about with the microbiome. Probiotics are something that are often supplemented with, and they can be useful for children with constipation particularly. We just like to have this little caveat saying that there is some question about probiotics being used for the high-risk immunocompromised population. If you have a child that is very, very high risk, you want to talk to your doctor about that. If you have a child that's more on a maintenance regime, I wouldn't consider that in the very high risk category where probiotics might be a concern, but definitely talk to your doctor either way about that before supplementing. I want to address the medications that affect eating. So generally the medicines that our children are on, they're quite toxic and they have a huge impact on the body. Nausea and vomiting is quite common. Constipation, I like to point out, if your child is struggling with constipation, they will have often a decreased appetite. So first and foremost, treat the constipation to make sure that that appetite can come back. The children can have taste alterations or an actual metallic taste in their mouth as a side effect of the medications. Oftentimes we have children who have a list of favorite foods before they begin treatment, and the morning they wake up after their first infusion, they won't touch any of their favorite foods for months or even years. So I bring that up because it's not something we can change. So we don't want to tell a child, but you've always loved strawberries. Strawberries are your favorite fruit. It's not going to change the fact that it's not right for them right now. It doesn't taste good for them right now. So we don't want to give them those messages that their feelings are wrong. Just accept the fact that they may have different tastes. They could have an increased appetite, certainly with steroids, or they could have a decreased appetite. So keep that in mind, and I'll talk a little bit more about steroids here. Those can also cause the strong cravings we see, particularly with sweet and salty foods. And then in combination with that, their fluid needs are increased because of the medications that are needing to be processed through their body. And at the same time, they can have a decreased thirst mechanism. So not only do they need more fluid, but they may not want to drink it. So more about steroids. The weight gain is something that weighs really heavy on our parents' hearts. I want to assure you that it is not a parent's fault. It's not something that you are doing or that it's your fault. It is from the adrenal changes that happen because of the medication and some increase in appetite. So what do we do about it? We want to have low-calorie snacks available. Oftentimes your child will eat a full meal and still not be satiated, not be satisfied. So we want to be able to have things available in between meals that if they need to munch on something, they can, and we know it's not contributing too much of an excess in calories. Also with steroids, that they need lower sodium foods in general. So if you haven't heard about this, be sure to talk to your doctor about that. If a child has a large sodium meal and they're on high-dose steroids, they can have a lot of bloating and discomfort. And the higher the sodium, the more uncomfortable they can feel. They also can have problems with high blood pressure. So sometimes sodium can help with that. Lower sodium can help with that. This handout includes a list of low-calorie, low-sodium foods that you can stock your house with. This is on the CureJM website, so don't worry about writing it all down. If you go into your search box and type in CureJM Nutrition, you're going to come up with a presentation similar to this, and also this handout in a PDF form that you could download, and other nutrition resources on the CureJM website. So when you're at the grocery store, I want to talk about how to find foods. So if we're looking for a low sodium food, you want to look for foods that are less than 250 milligrams sodium per serving. You're going to look down on the back, on the nutrition facts label for the sodium content. You can see this one says 870 milligrams. What I want you to note is that there are servings per container. So if your child were to consume this container, which oftentimes the serving size doesn't necessarily reflect what we might eat. So if this child eats this whole container, they're not getting 870 milligrams, they're getting in excess of 1,700 milligrams. So please pay attention to that serving size so you can make the choices you'd like to be making. So I want to talk a little bit about the special diets that you might have heard about. I want to stress, like Dr. Feldman said, that nutrition is very individual. So those guidelines that we talked about earlier, again, it's not an individual diet, it's just general guidelines to go by. We are all going to have food sensitivities, things that work for us and things that don't. It doesn't mean if we're sensitive to a food that we have an allergy to it. So we might go to an allergist and it might say it's negative. That doesn't mean that we don't have a sensitivity and that a particular food just might not be right for a particular individual. One thing that a lot of people ask me about is gluten. Should we go gluten-free? Certainly, I like to talk about the conversation of going gluten-free versus lowering gluten. If we look at a typical child's diet, and think about what they eat throughout the day, they might wake up and have some toast, they might have sandwich for lunch, they might have some crackers with their snack, they may have some bread, French bread or pasta for dinner, and maybe a cookie for dessert. That is a large amount of gluten going into their system all day long. So does it mean that you have to take gluten out entirely? Maybe yes, maybe no, but oftentimes when I work with people, if they simply lower the amount of gluten in their diet and replace it with non-gluten foods, there can be, those sensitivities can be lessened. The same can ring through with dairy. Sometimes children eat a lot of milk and a lot of cheese and yogurt, and we think it's a great thing until we realize it's a lot of dairy. So just lowering it sometimes can make them feel better. I want to put FODMAP foods on the list. FODMAP, again, I get a lot of questions about this, so I want to just address it. It's a list of foods that are sometimes used for irritable bowel syndrome or bacterial overgrowth, and it is a food elimination diet. So we take out a bunch of foods and then we gradually start to add them back in and see which foods create a reaction in that particular individual. Nightshades, I want to make sure to put out there because that is on the Arthritis Foundation's website. These are potentially foods, it's controversial. The research is not, the research is controversial, but they claim that there could be some inflammatory response in terms of arthritis. So I want to make sure that you're aware of that. I want to talk about anti-inflammatory benefits. So as a dietitian, I have a lot of people coming to me asking about anti-inflammatory diets. And what I want to point out is that when we're saying anti-inflammatory, we have to really understand what we're actually talking about. So a few examples here. A typical anti-inflammatory diet includes fruits, vegetables, fish, nuts and seeds, beans, a lot of fiber, and it avoids processed foods and limits salt and sugar. Then we have an autoimmune paleo anti-inflammatory diet, which avoids beans and legumes, avoids grains, dairy, eggs, nuts, seeds, nightshades, food chemicals, and additives. It includes eating quality meat and fish, fermented foods, fruits, and vegetables. Often it's an elimination diet and then with some reintroduction of certain foods. And then I also want to point out the plant-based or vegetarian way of eating, which avoids animal proteins and is also considered anti-inflammatory. What I want to point out here is that these are just 3 examples of anti-inflammatory styles of eating, and they're all very different to each other. So some of them stress animal proteins, some of them do not. Some of them include grains, some of them do not. So when you're talking about anti-inflammatory, it's not an all-inclusive definition. So what do? The more that we think about it, the more confused we get. And just like Dr. Feldman said, it's incredibly complicated. So here are some foods that have been studied that potentially are beneficial for autoimmune disease. So how do we use these foods? Bring them into your home, make them part of your grocery list on a regular basis. A lot of these foods, the berries, the flaxseed, the chia seeds, these can be easily thrown into a smoothie that a lot of kids can enjoy. You can also throw kale and spinach into a smoothie. Nuts, your almonds, walnuts, macadamia nuts. Make nuts a part of your pantry and make them a part of a regular snack time. So again, just bring these foods into the home, and maybe some foods that are there now, maybe start to have those foods disappear a little bit. So now I want to get in, I'm going to finish here before we take questions with the feeding environment. So I want to stress that nutrition is more about just the food that we put in front of our children. It is about feeding, it is parenting, it can be very positive, and it can also be incredibly negative and damaging as we're raising children. So I want to ask yourself, if there was a fly on your wall during mealtime at your house, what would that fly see? Would the fly see a family sitting at the table, having conversation, nutritious foods, everyone's trying new foods, engaged with each other? Would they see healthy foods, but no family engagement, no conversation? Would they say eating on the run or eating on the go? Historically, we all have busy schedules. At the moment, COVID has done wonders for the families I work with because we are now at home and we are cooking more and eating together more. But take a look at your schedule and see how that works for your family. Or is there a lot of negativity surrounding food? The child on the upper left clearly is not in a mood to be eating. Doesn't need to be at the table right now. Maybe he's being forced to eat when he doesn't want to. The family on the lower right, clearly there's a lot of stress and that child is feeling that. So if there's a lot of stress around mealtime, our appetites can do one of 2 things. They can go down, so a child won't want to eat at all, or they can react emotionally. And we've all heard of what emotional eaters are. When we get sad or upset, we sometimes turn to food for comfort. So what does a positive food environment look like? It means making mealtime a priority for your family. So looking at the schedule of the day and saying, do we really need to have all of these things in our day that are right around dinner time? Or should we, just involve our children in this food relationship? So have them be involved in the meal preparation. Get them in the kitchen preparing food. Allow them to serve themselves. Serve your meals family style so that they can learn to serve themselves. They will get it. They won't do it right at the start, but they need to learn their own appetite regulation, how much they, when they're hungry to eat, and when they're done, allow them to stop eating. Of course, it means offering healthy choices and certainly using snack time for children. Children need to eat often. Using snacks as an opportunity for healthy choices, not your traditional snack foods. Offering new foods along with familiar foods. So we're not going to get a child eating healthy if we constantly only serve them macaroni and cheese, chicken nuggets, and hot dogs. That's not the way we're going to do it. So serve them familiar foods, but also serve new foods all the time. And set that expectation that we'd like you to try new foods, but not with negative pressure. We don't want to end up with a puddle of tears at mealtime. But never give up on introducing foods. It can take greater than 10 or 20 times even before a child will get comfortable being around a new food and want to actually try to put it in their mouth. And most important, model trying foods that you don't like. So talk about, if you don't like tomatoes, talk about that and show them that you're trying. And every time you make a sandwich, you're trying to make that tomato slice just a little bit thicker, and you're working on that yourself. And teach them that your taste buds change throughout your life. And so even though you don't like your Brussels sprouts today, maybe you'll like them tomorrow. So positive food environment also focuses on the family time, not the food. So you want to keep your conversations positive. You want to avoid discussions about anyone's weight, whether someone's on a diet or someone's watching their weight or doesn't like what's cooked. You really don't want to have any sort of conversations like that when you're talking about children. We don't want them to view themselves in that way, that they have to gain weight or they have to lose weight. We just want them to view food as something fun and healthy that'll make us strong. And definitely have fun. This is a great thing to introduce with young children or older children. This is just an example of dinner time games. You can also do conversation starters. There's all kinds of things. But what this does is it helps children look forward to that meal and look forward to coming to the table and staying at the table longer. So in summary, try to eat real food, avoiding processed foods. Look for the imbalances in your child's diet, where that could be gluten, that could be dairy. Make changes slowly. If you are going to introduce a particular way of eating to your family, do it as a household all together, and do it slowly so no one is really shocked or upset by it. Have the proper vitamin mineral supplementation needed. Low sodium foods if you're on high dose steroids. Getting help from someone, a registered dietitian, if you are going to do any major restrictions or a special diet. Most important, model a healthy lifestyle for your family. So you don't have to be the CrossFit dad on the left necessarily, but we could try to be a little bit more engaged than the parent on the right. Just being active, staying busy, and trying to keep your family moving. Be aware of that mealtime environment and invest in your child's long-term relationship with food. It's okay if during these tough years it's not ideal, but again, they have this future ahead of them, this beautiful future, and we want them to enjoy food and make sure that food is going to be a positive thing. We don't want to cause eating disorders in our children because we are overanalyzing everything they eat. Just invest long term. And lastly, have a lot of fun. Get those kids in the kitchen and just make it a part of your lifestyle to have fun with food.